Nagoya, 21st of July, 1945. Noon heat shimmering off the rail yards, tar and smoke thick in the air, when the first silver B-29s glinted above the haze and nothing fell but paper. The canisters burst high and soft, and a snow of thin, pale rectangles turned in the hot updrafts, whispering as they fell onto tram roofs, garden plots, and the blackened ribs of factories already scarred by spring raids. An enemy that warns? Gunners muttered as they tracked contrails that never dove. On each leaflet, the insignia of the United States Army Air Forces, the seal hard against a field of tidy type, urged civilians to leave before the next attack. To crews trained to expect jellied gasoline and M69 clusters, the silence felt wrong. A battery officer later wrote that the rustle of paper in the July wind sounded more dangerous than bombs. By evening, the Army Ministry's telephones burned with reports from the Nagoya Defense Command. B-29s of XEX Bomber Command, big four-engined machines that cruised above 9,000 meters at speeds Japanese gunners rarely caught, had scattered warnings instead of fire. War Minister Korechika Anami was, officers later recalled, livid at the insult. Staff argued whether this was a trick to clog roads with refugees or a prelude to precision destruction that would arrive neighborhood by neighborhood. The next days made the meaning plainer. New drops named cities and urged evacuation within 48 hours. Police tallies counted millions of leaflets across Honshu. In early August, briefs reaching the palace reported that enemy papers predict exact destruction, and the phrase lodged like a splinter, a ruthless foe claiming moral choice and technological certainty at once. Japan had no counter to a doctrine that fused warnings with ruin. To understand how that doctrine was forged, we must step back to the years when American industry and airmen learned to make precision a weapon of mind as well as steel. September 1939, while Europe thundered under German armor, across the Atlantic, the air at Maxwell Field, Alabama was thick with chalk dust and speculation. In a classroom lined with maps of industrial grids, a handful of U.S. Army Air Corps officers argued over a heretical idea. Could a war be won by restraint rather than obliteration? The Geneva Convention's clauses on civilian safety hovered over every discussion, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt's warning against the ruthless bombing of civilians hung like a challenge. Yet these young theorists, graduates of the Air Corps Tactical School, believed that precision, not saturation, was the key to breaking an enemy's will. To them, moral warfare was not softness. It was science aimed at psychology. A well-placed bomb on a power plant, coupled with a warning that exposed its inevitability, could shatter confidence more deeply than 1,000 random raids. By 1941, the concept had seeped into doctrine. War Department planners framed it as strategic moral bombing, a phrase half moral, half mechanical. The object was no longer mere destruction of cities, but disruption of belief, the conviction that resistance still had purpose. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, this theory moved from classroom to command post. Under General Robert McClure, the newly organized Psychological Warfare Division began to formalize every element of persuasion from 10,000 feet. Leaflet typography, linguistic tone, the rhythm of warning versus fulfillment. Printing presses rolled in Algiers and later in London, translating messages into Italian, German, and Japanese with surgical precision. Their first test came over Sicily in July 1943. As B-17s roared over Catania, millions of leaflets fluttered down, promising food and humane treatment for those who surrendered. Within days, entire Italian battalions laid down their arms. Reports marked the experiment a success. Morale had collapsed where paper had preceded fire. 2 years later, those same principles, precision, prediction, and persuasion, would reach their apotheosis over Japan, confronting a warrior culture that equated mercy with weakness. The coming campaign would prove whether morality itself could be weaponized. By the winter of 1944, the Pacific skies burned nightly with the glare of magnesium flares and tracer fire. Yet behind those infernos, a quieter conflict raged in Washington's war rooms, a battle over conscience. The United States had reached the edge of a paradox. To end a war born of brutality, it risked embracing the same logic of total destruction. General Curtis E. LeMay, newly appointed commander of the WWII Bomber Command, believed in results measured in tons of debris. "Precision," he reportedly said, "is a peacetime luxury." His squadrons of B-29 super fortresses could deliver 20,000 pounds of incendiaries from 30,000 feet, an industrialized firestorm that no wooden city could survive. Across the Pacific, the air crews at Guam and Tinian prepared for what LeMay envisioned as the decisive blow: burn Japan's war production out of existence. But in Washington, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, an austere lawyer steeped in moral philosophy, refused to let the arithmetic of destruction go unchallenged. He reminded planners of Roosevelt's 1939 declaration that the ruthless bombing of civilians was incompatible with democracy's cause. Stimson urged that, where feasible, civilians must be warned, not as charity, but as proof that America's power was bound by ethics. His proposal clashed with LeMay's pragmatism, but intrigued analysts within the Office of War Information. They saw an experiment in morale engineering. Could fear, not fire, collapse Japan's will faster? As Operation Meeting House loomed, the code name for the March 1945 assault on Tokyo, the compromise took form. Millions of leaflets, labeled Form P-47, were printed and scattered over selected cities. Their message was startlingly humane. "We do not wish to harm innocent people. Evacuate immediately." General Umezu Yoshijiro denounced them as an insult wrapped in cowardice, but ordinary families clutched them in trembling hands, uncertain whether to believe the enemy's mercy. Trains swelled with refugees fleeing inland. Panic mingled with disbelief. Thus began a moral experiment conducted amid the glow of impending fire, a test of whether humanity could coexist with total war. On Saipan's dusty airstrips in February 1945, the rhythm of modern war no longer came from rifles or engines, but from the thrum of presses and propellers working in concert. Each American Mercy leaflet began not with a writer, but with machinery. The Model 41 rotary press inside the U.S. government printing office in Washington, D.C., its steel rollers, inked black and relentless, could turn out 1.5 million sheets an hour. The product was not poetry, but persuasion. Translations checked by linguists, slogans balanced between threat and civility, warnings meant to sound both humane and inevitable. Once printed, the bundles moved by ship and air to the Pacific, where the industrial miracle of mass literacy met the industrial miracle of flight. By late 1944, the process had gone global. Field presses on Saipan and Guam ran day and night under floodlights, feeding missions codenamed Ashcan. Here, the 509th Composite Group, the same formation later tied to atomic operations, adapted their 4-engine B-29 superfortresses to carry both bombs and propaganda. Each Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine delivered 2,200 horsepower, lifting the giant craft over 30,000 feet and across a 3,200-mile radius. Special leaflet canisters replaced high-explosive clusters. Set to burst at pre-programmed altitudes, they released a blizzard of thin white rectangles that drifted over cities hours or days before the incendiaries arrived. Japan's air defenses, built around the aging Type 99 anti-aircraft gun and searchlights calibrated for lower targets, could do little against these high-flying intruders. Radar operators often misread the missions as harmless reconnaissance, unaware that the real payload was psychological. The Americans were demonstrating a new synthesis of technology and morality, machines that could deliver both warning and annihilation from the same bomb bay. As LeMay's fleet fueled for Operation Meeting House, those presses and engines formed two halves of the same weapon, the mechanical heart of a strategy that claimed to kill without cruelty, even as it prepared to set Tokyo ablaze. Tokyo, night of March 9-10, 1945. A warm wind swept in from Tokyo Bay, carrying the smell of kerosene and rainless dust when the first wave of B-29s crossed the coast. At 12:08 a.m., the city of wood and paper became a sea of flame. More than 300 superfortresses, each flying from bases in the Marianas, dropped nearly 1,700 tons of M69 incendiaries, each cluster designed to ignite within seconds and cling like molten resin. Streets vanished beneath rolling fire, the oxygen drawn from the lungs of those who fled. Fire breaks meant to stop the spread instead turned into funnels of heat, and in a few hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo's heart were gone. The temperature in some districts reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt iron street lamps and boil the Sumida River into steam. Yet the strangest part of the attack was what had come before it. Days earlier, psychological warfare units had sent warning leaflets over 11 industrial cities, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka among them, but not Tokyo. The omission was deliberate, part of a grim control experiment conceived in Washington. Analysts wanted to know if advance warning altered morale, evacuation, or production. It did. Police reports from the warned regions described hysterical exoduses, trains jammed with civilians clutching bundles of belongings, and factories struggling to keep workers on the line. Those spared the warning, Tokyo above all, suffered confusion that turned to disbelief when they realized that America had chosen where to show mercy. In the aftermath, intercepted Japanese communications revealed a mix of rage and fear. Some commanders denounced the leaflets as cowardly theater, but others whispered that such accuracy could only mean enemy spies in their midst. From Washington, analysts noted that panic now spread faster than flames. Even LeMay, the hard pragmatist, admitted later that the panic cost the enemy more than the fires themselves. The experiment had worked. Terror by choice, not chance. What began as a moral gesture had become a psychological scalpel, soon to be honed to atomic precision. By June 1945, even as Japan's front lines crumbled, the real panic had taken root not in the trenches but within the marble corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters. The Americans' paper weapons were multiplying. Leaflets now arrived faster than intelligence reports could classify them, each carrying the same unnerving blend of menace and mercy. In response, a new analytical unit, Kosaku Butai, or Counter-Propaganda Corps, was formed under the Army General Staff to study their wording, distribution, and effect. What they found unsettled even the most hardened officers. Civilians had begun quoting the leaflets as though they carried divine authority. Market rumors claimed, "The enemy spares the merciful," and peasants whispered that those who obeyed the warnings lived while the stubborn perished. Such talk violated everything the imperial ethos demanded. Silence, loyalty, and sacrifice unto death. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, the chief of the Naval General Staff, railed before his peers that the Americans were weaponizing compassion. To him, the leaflets were poison wrapped in morality, dissolving the will to fight more effectively than any bomb. Worse still, by midsummer, the messages had become eerily specific. On July 27, 1945, U.S. aircraft scattered sheets listing several cities by name, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Niigata among them. The warning promised destruction if Japan refused surrender. Police in Hiroshima noted a sudden thinning of the streets as families fled to the countryside. Few believed the threat completely, but many chose not to test it. When the Enola Gay released the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6th, survivors later recalled having seen papers that told us to leave. For Japan's Supreme War Council, the shock was existential. America now controlled not only the air, but the narrative itself, an enemy so confident it could announce its blows before striking. The empire's physical defenses still stood, but its psychological fortress had already collapsed. By the summer of 1945, the United States had turned persuasion itself into an industry. While Japan's munitions factories rationed copper and cloth, America's presses consumed rivers of ink and paper in the name of psychological war. Across Pacific outposts, from Saipan to Tinian, the air smelled of solvent and hot metal as rotary presses thundered day and night. At peak output, more than 65 million leaflets rolled off their cylinders each month, part of a coordinated campaign known as Project Warning. The 313th Bombardment Wing oversaw the operation like a factory line of the mind, its officers scheduling drops with meteorologists to catch favorable, wines and linguists to tune every word to Japan's regional speech. The translators were often Japanese, Americans of the Military Intelligence Service, second generation, Nisei soldiers who shaped sentences not as soldiers, but as neighbors. They stripped out military jargon, softened imperatives into civic advice, and chose idioms familiar to farmers and shopkeepers in Kansai and Kyushu. Their craft lay in precision tone, a voice that sounded local enough to trust yet foreign enough to terrify. Each leaflet passed through more than 30 hands before loading, typesetters, censors, printers, and airmen. The supply chain feeding this moral weapon was vast. Paper convoys sailed from San Francisco. Ink traveled in cooled reefer vessels under the quartermaster corps, and mobile print shops operated from converted B-29 hangars on Tinian's coral runways. Psychologists within the Office of War. Information designed message cycles alternating between mercy and menace. "Evacuate now and live," followed days later by, "We know where your arsenal is." This rhythm, they calculated, would first soothe, then strike. Post-war diaries confirmed the method's power. Families fled en masse from cities named in leaflets, crippling factories before bombs ever fell. America had discovered a new kind of weapon, one that used literacy itself as ammunition. Watching evacuation trains choke the rails, Japan's commanders grasped the unbearable truth. Words could destroy industry as surely as fire. August 1st, 1945. Tokyo's ruins still smoldered as silver wings once again traced contrails over Japan's battered mainland. This time, the payload was not fire but paper. Millions of Type 10 leaflets cascading from B-29s across 35 cities. Their language was colder, more deliberate than before. Read this carefully. "We are in possession of the ultimate weapon. Evacuate immediately." No weapon was named, but the tone was absolute, as though the writers spoke from beyond conventional war. Intelligence officers within Japan's Home Ministry puzzled over the phrase, ultimate weapon. Some believed it referred to new incendiaries or poison gas. Others, more superstitious, whispered of divine retribution. The texts were translated, debated, and filed away, one more act of American intimidation. 5 days later, at 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, the meaning became incandescent. A single B-29 Enola Gay released a bomb named Little Boy over Hiroshima, and the morning sky turned white. Within seconds, the city vanished in light hotter than the sun. At first, imperial analysts dismissed the initial reports as hysterical exaggeration. No single device could destroy a metropolis. But by the next evening, reconnaissance flights confirmed what physics had rewritten. Hiroshima no longer existed. When another leaflet wave preceded the August 9th strike on Nagasaki, the warning no longer seemed psychological. It was prophecy. Even the hardest men in the War Ministry faltered. General Korechika Anami, long the symbol of resistance, privately conceded that the Americans strike with God's hand. The paradox was unbearable. An enemy who announced annihilation before enacting it, whose mercy preceded its might. The very act of warning, once a gesture of honor despised by Bushido, had become the ultimate show of dominance. As Emperor Hirohito prepared his surrender address, the leaflets littering Japan's fields and gutters told the real story. The war for hearts and minds had ended with the mind's defeat. For Japan's civilians, the American leaflets were not merely paper. They were verdicts falling from the sky. In Nagasaki, schoolteacher Fumiko Yamada later recalled nights when no one in her neighborhood slept. "If they warned us, maybe it is real," she wrote. "But if we flee, the police will call us traitors." That was the torment shared by millions. To obey a foreign message risked suspicion and arrest. To ignore it risked death. The Kenpei Tai, Japan's feared military police, ordered that anyone caught keeping the enemy papers be punished for defeatism. Yet countless families slipped the leaflets beneath tatami mats or folded them into family Bibles, believing that possession itself might offer protection, as if mercy, Printed in English could shield them from fire. American. Analysts later calculated that nearly 40% of civilians who received the warnings believed them credible, an unprecedented confession of trust in total war. The result was chaos wrapped in hope. Railways filled with evacuees. Towns near Osaka and Kobe emptied overnight. Those who stayed watched the skies, counting planes and wondering if the paper had chosen their fate. Some leaflets carried crude silhouettes of bombs hovering above maps, their precision uncanny. When those very cities later burned or vanished, the leaflets seemed prophetic, almost divine in authority. After Hiroshima's annihilation, survivors who had fled because of the warnings wrote of emotions too tangled for the old language of loyalty. One diary recorded, "I hated them for killing us, but thanked them for telling us." In that paradox lay the birth of a new kind of warfare, where destruction spoke in words, and compassion could terrify more deeply than hate. As the Empire's guns fell silent, the sound that lingered was the rustle of paper, America's final weapon, whispering that the war for Japan's soul was already lost. Even before Japan faced its final reckoning, word of America's strange new warfare had spread through the collapsing Axis. In Europe, captured German officers in early 1945 spoke of similar leaflets dropped by RAF and U.S. bombers over the Ruhr and Rhineland, pamphlets warning civilians to flee before the next attack. Yet the psychological effect in Germany was nothing like that in Japan. Joseph Goebbels's propaganda apparatus instantly labeled the papers Anglo-American deception, insisting that no civilized enemy would waste ink to show mercy. In the Reich, disbelief was policy. In Japan, it became doubt. Where Germans were saturated with counter-narratives, Japan's censorship left the population sealed inside silence. Thus, when American planes dropped warnings, the absence of competing voices lent them the tone of prophecy. In April 1945, as Berlin's ruins smoldered, Japan's naval attachés in Europe cabled home an unnerving summary. The same leaflets precede annihilation. The message was clear: ignore them at peril. The Imperial General Staff took note but found no answer. Japan's own attempts to mimic the tactic only exposed its weakness. During the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese planes scattered poorly translated pamphlets over U.S. lines, urging Marines to surrender to honorable treatment. The effort collapsed under its own irony. The tone was shrill, the threats obvious, and not a single Allied unit wavered. The Americans, by contrast, had built consistency into fear itself. Every city warned was eventually struck. Every promise of devastation was fulfilled with scientific precision. That pattern transformed compassion into credibility, and credibility into terror. By the summer of 1945, Japan's generals began to ask a heretical question in their war councils. Was America's moral restraint more dangerous than its bombs? In that paradox lay the essence of their defeat, an enemy who conquered through both mercy and mastery. When the smoke of Tokyo still hung over the Pacific horizon, America's airmen and planners began to measure the true impact of their moral bombing experiment. In post-war analyses compiled by the DT-1 Bomber Command, General Curtis LeMay's staff quantified what had once seemed intangible: the effect of warning before destruction. Their conclusion was startling. Civilians who fled in anticipation of the attacks had cleared industrial neighborhoods, allowing bombers to strike harder and lower, raising overall efficiency by an estimated 12 to 18%. Firestorms burned cleaner when the human presence was gone. What had begun as a gesture of restraint had in practice sharpened the blade. At the strategic level, the leaflets proved that the United States could control every dimension of war: timing, information, and perception. Japan's leaders found themselves reacting not to explosions but to expectation itself. Historians would later call it the first coordinated psychological air campaign in human history. The moral veneer also had post-war consequences. By conditioning civilians to associate American raids with warnings and selectivity, the Allies unintentionally softened the transition to occupation. Surveys conducted by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers in 1946 recorded remarkably low hostility toward American forces. especially in leaflet-targeted regions. Inside Japan, however, the same tactic tore at the empire's foundations. Prefectural governors complained that constant evacuations crippled ration distribution and shattered labor quotas. Reports from the Home Ministry noted that civilian trust in the emperor's protection declines daily. By July 1945, even army morale bulletins confessed that the population no longer believed victory possible. Thus, the campaign's final success was not measured in tons of bombs or miles of ruin, but in faith destroyed. Long before the planned invasion, the Americans already possessed their ultimate weapon, a nation that had lost the will to resist. When Japan's surrender echoed through Tokyo on August 15, 1945, the leaflets that had once fluttered down like threats became artifacts of uneasy conscience. In Washington, victory did not silence the argument, it deepened it. Physicist Leo Szilard, whose moral protests shadowed the atomic project itself, warned that a warning before annihilation does not erase annihilation. To him, mercy delivered by machine was no mercy at all. But inside the War Department, defenders of the campaign countered that millions had lived precisely because of those warnings. Air Force analysts pointed to post-war surveys showing that 40% of Japan's urban survivors credited the leaflets for their decision to evacuate. In that arithmetic, paper had saved lives even as fire consumed cities. Across occupied Japan, the leaflets took on a second life. Newspapers called them unmei no kami, papers of fate. The new education ministry exhibited them in classrooms beside burned maps of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, teaching students that survival sometimes came printed in a foreign tongue. Yet the ethical riddle refused resolution. Did America warn out of compassion or out of cold calculation to magnify fear? To some theologians and veterans, the act stood as proof of conscience amid horror. To others, it marked the beginning of psychological total war, where mercy itself could be weaponized. Historians now see the leaflet campaign as a hinge between eras, the moment industrial war turned into informational war. The press, the bomber, and the mind had merged into a single system of control. For Japan's former commanders, the memory remained spectral. The enemy who once promised death by leaflet had kept every promise, and in doing so, had foretold something larger, a world where even warnings could wound. In the years after 1945, the paper storms over Japan became more than a wartime curiosity. They became doctrine. As the Cold War dawned, the U.S. military recognized that the power once used to terrify Japan could also shape behavior long before bombs ever fell. By 1950, the newly formed U.S. Air Force formally incorporated civilian warning and influence into its psychological operations manuals. Korea provided the testing ground. Leaflets promised safety to defectors, urged surrenders, and offered corridors of mercy that mirrored the wartime warnings over Nagoya and Osaka. Operation Mula in 1953, offering $100,000 to any MiG-15 pilot who defected, was a direct descendant of that logic. It was persuasion by preemption. Alter the mind, and the battlefield will follow. Through Vietnam, the Gulf, and Iraq, the legacy endured. Broadcasters and leaflet teams repeated the same moral choreography: threat, warning, then strike. The atomic age had made total destruction conceivable yet politically unthinkable. Information had to replace annihilation as the weapon of choice. What began as wartime mercy became Cold War management. By the late 20th century, even Japan had turned to this philosophy. During its peacekeeping missions in Cambodia and Iraq, the Japanese self-defense forces distributed flyers written in local languages, urging civilians to stay clear of combat zones, an echo, consciously or not, of 1945's warnings. Historians now trace the birth of modern information warfare to those papers of conscience dropped over Japan. They marked the moment when moral choice became a strategic instrument. As one Japanese scholar wrote decades later, the leaflets fell not only on cities, but upon humanity's conscience. In their fragile pages lay the blueprint for an age when wars would be fought, less for territory than for belief, a war of persuasion without end. In the hush that followed Japan's surrender, the air above the islands was finally empty. No engines, no sirens, only the echo of what had fallen. Yet the memories still drifted down. Farmers turning their fields in the early 1950s sometimes uncovered fragments of paper, pale and stiff with age, their English words still faintly visible. Evacuate. We do not wish to harm you. To those who had survived, the message was both balm and scar, a reminder that mercy and menace had once shared the same sky. The leaflets had outlasted the war, their thin fibers carrying the story of how humanity had learned to fight with psychology as much as steel. For many Japanese, the experience marked a transition more profound than defeat itself. The Americans had not only conquered through fire, but had forced the world to confront a new dimension of war, one fought in conscience and perception. Historians would later describe the leaflet campaign as a mirror of the 20th century's dual nature, capable of invention and empathy, yet inseparable from destruction. As the last veterans from both sides looked back, the image that endured was not the glare of Hiroshima or the roar of engines over Tokyo, but the quiet drift of white paper in a dark sky. Even amid humanity's fiercest conflict, something had whispered from above, "You still have time to live."